Welcome to This Explainer. Okay, today we're diving into a really fascinating source that completely reframes how we look at faith. We're so used to seeing belief portrayed as this loud, unshakable, almost theatrical performance. But what if it's not? What if real faith is actually just a quiet, everyday act of trust? Let's get right into it. The source immediately hooks us by asking a pretty profound question. Does true belief actually require loud certainty? Think about that for a second. It really validates this quiet shame that so many of us carry, that nagging feeling that your belief is just, well, too small. Or maybe it's too full of doubt, especially when you compare it to those incredibly confident, megaphone-wielding voices we constantly see around us. We are constantly fed these inherited lies, right? The idea that real faith absolutely has to be loud, that it never wavers, and that doubt is literally the ultimate enemy. But the actual truth uncovered here is so much more forgiving. Real belief is about small faith. It's about those trembling prayers and simply scattering whatever you happen to have. It's a massive, comforting shift away from this exhausting idea of spiritual performance. And man, carrying that burden of small belief has a real physical weight to it. When you compare yourself to those perfectly polished believers on social media, it's just exhausting. It makes you internalize this awful idea that unanswered prayers are somehow a direct verdict on your faith, or that your doubts completely invalidate your trust. It leaves people carrying this heavy, quiet shame right behind the breastbone, kind of making them feel like a thinner version of themselves. But here is the absolute crucial takeaway. Loudness was never the harvest. Loudness was only the noise. When you see surface confidence in someone else, you're merely looking at a measurement of how loudly they've learned to perform. Volume does not equal spiritual depth. Not even close. All right, let's move into section 1, redefining belief, the mustard seed. So the source gives us a completely new definition here. Belief isn't some intense feeling you have to manufacture to convince the divine to act. Instead, it's the incredibly simple physical act of putting a kernel into the ground. It's about scattering what you have without needing to drum up overwhelming feelings of certainty first. You literally just let the kernel go. It all comes down to the number one single act. Whether it's a widow praying over her son for 19 years, or a teenager whispering a single prayer in a quiet house because her family doesn't pray aloud, it all counts. The mustard seed was chosen as the ultimate example for a very specific reason. To the original audience, it was the absolute smallest seed imaginable. This is a total game changer. Smallness is the qualification, not the disqualification. Whatever small trust you hold in your hand right now, it is entirely enough. Why? Well, because you can't plant a boulder. You can only plant a small seed. Your smallness isn't a failure. Actually, it's exactly what's required to begin. Okay, moving right along to section 2, the mechanics of unseen growth. Let's map out the timeline of this ancient parable from Mark chapter 4. On day 1, a man scatters seed. Then, for days and nights, he literally just goes on with his life. He sleeps, he rises. Weeks later, the seed sprouts, and he has absolutely no idea how it works. The growth happens entirely in the dark, without requiring the farmer to understand the biology or the chemistry of the soil. There is a massive, and I mean massive, division of labor here. Your job as the planter is shockingly simple. Scatter the seed, sleep, rise, and go on living an ordinary day. That's it. The earth's job, the divine's job, is to work under the surface, sprout the seed, and produce the harvest. You are not meant to do the heavy lifting of the actual growing. You were never supposed to be in charge of the growing. Think about how exhausting it is when you try to force your faith to be bigger or produce results faster. It's literally like a farmer standing out in a field at 3 a.m. screaming at a seed to perform. It's absurd, it doesn't work, and it just makes you incredibly tired. Your only job was to scatter. Delay is not the diagnosis. Silence is not the verdict. For anyone waiting on an answer, this is immensely comforting. Silence is simply the soil keeping the work covered until it's ready to come up. A buried seed isn't being ignored, it's being prepared. Which brings us nicely to section 3, the timeline of the harvest. So, how does this unseen growth finally surface into our visible lives? It happens in 3 distinct stages. First, you get the blade, a tiny, easily overlooked green sign of movement. Then comes the ear, the structure that's eventually going to hold the green. And finally, the full green, the final harvest. Keep in mind, a tiny blade is still a yes. These stages aren't delays, they're the answer arriving in slow motion. You might be between the blade and the ear right now, and that is definitely not nothing. Applying this agricultural framework to our lives really changes everything. A disappointing harvest isn't a failure, it's just a purpose-driven season of crop rotation. Children learn belief by physically watching their parents scatter seeds, not through long, drawn-out lectures. Times of abundance actually carry a hidden risk. They trick us into thinking the growing is completely over. And crucially, waiting is not rotting. Some of the greatest harvests take 25 to 50 years to finally surface. So, how do we actually do this? Section 4. The daily practice. To make all these abstract concepts totally actionable, the source gives us a simple breathing practice. On the in-breath, you ask the prayer. On the out-breath, you let go and trust. The real trick here is making that out-breath longer than the in-breath. It becomes a physical, tangible representation of trusting that the kernel is doing its work beneath the soil completely without your supervision. I absolutely love this quote. Exhaling is the part where you stop digging the seed up to check on it. Framing the exhale as a profound form of belief is just so powerful. That long sigh of letting go lands every bit as powerfully as a loud, performative shout. Next up is the daily mantra, a super simple 3-step process. First, ask yourself, have I scattered the seed? Second, speak your name gently into the room. Then, state out loud, I have scattered the seed. By practicing this daily without improvising, you actually train your own ears to recognize that you've done the one small thing that belief actually requires of you. But hey, transformation takes time. On your 10th attempt, the internal shift might still be completely invisible. But by the 30th attempt, that inner voice of comparison, it really loses its bite. By the 50th, you're praying freely without rehearsing for an audience. And by the 100th attempt, you finally notice that undeniable green blade in your life. The whole act shifts from an anxious audition into the casual, everyday act of a farmer simply making breakfast. The seed is already in you. The growing is already happening. What a fantastic, grounding thought to hold on to. And as a quick heads up, if you want to keep going with this, the source actually offers 7 free letters in their pinned comments to accompany your next 7 mornings of practice. It's just a great reminder that the work is already underway right beneath the surface. Bringing it all together, the size of your kernel is never the issue. It's only your willingness to scatter it. Growth comes through this quiet scattering, not loud performance. Not knowing the how is deeply permitted and honored. And finally, you were never meant to walk this field alone. Smallness is perfectly sufficient, and just going on with an ordinary day is in itself a profound act of faith. So I'll leave you with this final, lingering thought to chew on as you go about your day. Have you scattered your seed today? And are you willing to simply let the earth do the rest? Consider what might already be growing beneath the surface of your life, right now in the dark, just waiting to break through. Thanks for joining me for this explainer, and keep scattering.